Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Success Factors for a Nonprofit Merger webinar hosted by Vista Global Coaching and Consulting and Public Interest Management Group. We're excited to share with you some of the highlights from the case study of the merger between two youth mentoring organizations in Wisconsin. My name is Mary Stelletello. I'm principal and founder of Vista Global Coaching and Consulting based in Madison, Wisconsin. Vista Global offers services in the areas of organizational transformation, governance, leadership, development, coaching, and facilitation. Joining us today as co-host is Scott Schaffer, principal and founder of Public Interest Management Group based in Seattle, Washington, with operations in Canada. PIM Group delivers strategic management consulting services to nonprofit organizations, integrating financial analysis and organizational development tools. And we wouldn't be here without Lindsay Fenlon, who's CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of East Central Wisconsin, based in Neenah, Wisconsin. Big Brothers Big Sisters helps children realize their potential and build their future by creating and supporting one-to-one mentoring relationships that ignite the power and promise of youth. Today's webinar will consist of several sections. We'll do an overview of the case, the general steps to merger process, and presentation of key success factors of this particular merger. We will then have 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A, and we are recording this webinar and we'll send the link following the event. Participants are all muted without your video, so please enter any questions you have throughout the presentation and we'll answer them during the Q&A session. If you're a Twitter enthusiast, we'd love for you to tweet during the webinar using the Twitter handle of Vista Global CC and the hashtag of BBBS merger. So let's get started. I will turn it over to Scott Schaffer to begin with an overview of the case. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So Mary and I have worked together for a long time, and we work together as consultants very often on merger projects. And we worked on a project starting a couple of years ago that we felt, as it evolved and then finally resulted in consolidation, it just made for an excellent example of how a merger process can work. And so that's what led us to record this in the form of a case study, because we felt it could be very educational and illustrative of some of those things that we've found to be best practices. So this case study is about two organizations in central Wisconsin, and they both were youth mentoring organizations. They had similar missions. They worked in adjacent and somewhat overlapping service areas. And they came together at various points in their history. It looked like this might happen. It finally did happen. The circumstances were right. And they came together to merge. One of the organizations was a Big Brothers Big Sisters affiliate. It was called Big Brothers Big Sisters of the Fox Valley region. The other was known as Best Friends of Neenah, Menasha, which are different communities in that area. And Best Friends was not an affiliate of Big Brothers Big Sisters, was an independent nonprofit. Both of these organizations were very good at certain things. They had certain assets and constituencies that supported them. They had a lot of passion. They were very mission focused. And they also had certain constraints that are very common to relatively small and medium-sized nonprofits. So this is the story that we're going to get into of what happened after they decided they were going to pursue this. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mary.
Thanks, Scott. So I'm going to give you a bit of the overview of the journey that we walked together with Big Brothers Big Sisters and Best Friends over the almost 2 years from the beginning. And as Scott mentioned, Big Brothers Big Sisters and Best Friends of Neenah Menasha had long histories providing similar services in the region. Both organizations had strong reputations. However, they were competing for visibility, mentors, and resources that were really essential for achieving their missions. As Scott mentioned, the board of directors had previously discussed the idea of partnership, but the conversations did not move forward in earnest until the two executive directors, who were relatively new to their positions and were not rooted so deeply in the past, came together in spring of 2018 to discuss the possibilities of a brighter future. In spring of 2018, Lindsay and her counterpart, Jamie Krewald, contacted me to have an introductory conversation about how might they even begin this process of exploring a strategic partnership. And over lunch, we talked about the phases of the process, starting with assessment. Often organizations jump right to negotiations without really exploring the motivations, potential risks, the assets that each of the organizations could bring to a possible partnership, and the potential legal structures. Merger is not the only form of strategic partnership. Other possible structures are program collaboration, joint venture, and other types of strategic alliances. The assessment was completed over approximately 4 months. And based on the results of the assessment, each organization's board of directors passed a resolution to enter into the partnership negotiations process for a period of 6 months. Each board appointed 3 board members and the executive director to a joint negotiations committee, which was given the authority to negotiate a variety of issues and make recommendations to each organization's board of directors for final approval. The committee does not and did not have the authority to change the legal structure of the organization. Only the full board of directors has that authority. So negotiations were conducted over a period of 6 months. Vista Global facilitated monthly 4-hour meetings to come to agreement on a variety of topics. Legal and financial due diligence was conducted, and a financial and operational framework was defined for a combined organization. And Scott will go into a little more detail regarding the business model analysis in a few minutes. Once the joint committee came to agreement on the significant operational and governance topics of a combined organization, these agreements were put into a legal plan of merger by an attorney that has experience in nonprofit legal structures and understands nonprofit law in Wisconsin. Each organization's board of directors reviewed and approved the plan of merger and determined an effective date for the combined organization. The board approvals took place in July of 2019, and the legal effective date of the merger was January 1st, 2020. Now, oftentimes by this point in the journey, we see merger fatigue within the board and staff leadership. Negotiations take a lot of effort, and it's easy to feel like you've crossed the finish line when a plan of merger is approved. However, that's just giving the organization the roadmap to actually integrate into a combined organization. And that's this third phase, the integration phase. So the staff and board took a deep breath and remained focused throughout the integration process that began in August of 2019, developing an implementation plan for the subsequent 18 months with the support of Vista Global. Integration entails multifaceted process that's combining or reinventing or creating new systems and structures that are necessary to support the new organization. With the merger, Big Brothers Big Sisters had a combined staff of 17. So the integration process was really an all hands on deck process, engaging almost all of the staff and board members with function-specific expertise, examples in human resources and marketing, as well as outside vendors, including IT consultants and accounting consultants. However, the bottom line about integration, it's really about creating a united organizational culture, because it is the people that make organizations successful, not just systems. So I want to share with you some of the common obstacles that often come up or may surface during a process, and they're presented here on this slide. And any one of these obstacles could be unsurmountable and result in an agreement not to move forward further with negotiations. These obstacles are items that consultants can identify and support the Joint Negotiations Committee to navigate. And I want to highlight a few of these obstacles that were actually navigated during the Big Brothers Big Sisters merger process. As a timing relative to leadership change, as I mentioned earlier, that this was actually an obstacle that did pause the process. When the board had initially started a potential conversation, it was under different leadership. Another area of obstacle was limited options considered, and that was actually addressed in the partner assessment process. And during the assessment, we looked at, and the committee at that time, the study committee, looked at various options as far as the partnership structure. And lastly, culture. And as I mentioned just recently, that culture and the people is something that can either support or derail an integration process. And both the executive directors were very aware of their different cultures and proactively were addressing culture in the integration process. So I want to now take a look at what are those topics and how are we spending these 4-hour meetings every month. What you see here on your screen are really the broad categories that the Joint Negotiation Committee explores. And at the beginning of the negotiation phase, Scott and myself had individual interviews with each of the Joint Committee members to surface any other key questions or issues of concern. And we folded those into the negotiation process. A few examples of each of these different categories. So with respect to governance, what's the new board going to look like? Each of the organizations had different board structures and terms and term limits. With respect to finances or the financial area, are there any restrictions on any of the financial assets of either organization? Are there grant commitments? And that area is also reviewed in the due diligence process and reviewing the different documents. With respect to human resources, one of the biggest questions that is faced during a merger negotiation process is who will lead the combined organization. And neither Lindsay or Jamie were leaving their roles, so this was an important question for the committee to discuss. With respect to capital, question there was where would the main office be located? They were in different communities, and how would they make a decision where the headquarter main office would be? In the area of programs, questions around, do we keep all of the programs? Are there overlaps in the current programs of each of the organizations? And one of the big questions here was, how do we handle matching the mentors to the youth in the combined organization? They had 2 different processes to do that. With respect to communications and marketing, and this was a kind of a non-negotiable with respect to this merger, because the Big Brothers Big Sisters is an affiliate of a national organization with a national brand, was Best Friends comfortable with accepting the Big Brothers Big Sisters mission and their branding, which was one of the agreements that was discussed and finalized. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, culture. They had 2 different cultures. One organization was the national affiliate identity and was Big Brothers Big Sisters, and Best Friends was a locally grown identity. And how do you combine those 2 types of cultures? So as you can see, there are many topics for negotiation. And as a consultant, I would hold an objective viewpoint to support the committee in examining the possibilities and then coming to an agreement. And at the end of each meeting, the agreements would be verified and documented. And this was actually an ongoing document that eventually we used to develop the plan of merger. So now I'd like to turn over the presentation to Lindsay Fenlon, CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters, and she's going to begin the discussion of some of the key success factors of the Big Brothers Big Sisters merger. Lindsay?
Mary, hearing you go back through all that we had to go through as part of the negotiation phase, it kind of brought a layer of oh my gosh, we did all of that. It's really amazing to see all that was in part of the process. So I'm Lindsay. I'm with Big Brothers Big Sisters, and really the very first key factor, and it has to be at the heart of what this is about. And that's why I think Mary put it in the middle, right? Is that focus on the mission. And building on existing strengths. So anyone who studied change management will tell you people have to first understand the why is this happening and what's in it for me before they can really get on board. And so we really took it back to, it is not about who our name is or what our community history is. It is about what do we want to achieve in the future. And when we were able to start really having those conversations with people, we said, you know, do you care if this mentoring program only lives for 5 more years under this name? Or are you okay if it lives under a different name, or if it looks slightly different, but it lasts for 5 more decades? And so that really helped as it related to making sure that when things got rough, or when people started getting very emotionally charged about what was happening, and not just employees, we had donors, funders, longtime participants in the program who were very emotionally invested. Being able to focus it back on that mission was really important. One of the other early key success factors is that we knew pretty immediately we couldn't do this on our own. I know every community has different levels of relationships with funders and things of that nature, but we knew we needed a couple things. We knew we were going to need outside operational support if we were going to truly do this process. We also knew we needed outside operational support to do the process. I think sometimes in the nonprofit sector, we've got a lot of heart and we've got a lot of passion and a lot of loyalty amongst constituents served and donors, but there tends to not always be as much business acumen, especially around mergers and integration and how that works. And so myself and Jamie, who was the executive director for Best Friends, the other agency, knew we needed to not only bring on Mary, we knew we needed to bring on other partners as well. We did not have the legal opportunity in-house or represented on our board. We didn't have the financial acumen to do business modeling. And so we started having conversations with some of our key corporate partners, and they actually were really grateful that we went down this path. Anyone who is in a nonprofit and has ever filled out a grant application knows that one of the recurring questions is, who else is doing similar work in the community and how are you collaborating? So our funders were ready to say, look, you're both doing great things, but we'd rather give you a larger pot of money under one name and have you do more. And so that willingness on the part of our funders is actually is kind of the emotional mental capital we use to get our board involved, are on board, because our board members were very cognizant of their role being the balance between our agency and the people in the community. And so when we were able to say, we have people who are willing to give us money to do this and to do it better and to do it right, it really helped them see that it was time. It was time to move forward and just have the conversation. That's what we kept telling them. Let's just have the conversation. Let's see what the feasibility study comes back with. We joked, we were like, Mary will give us a couple options. She really just came back with one, but she gave us a couple because for us, it really did make sense to merge. Not merging would have caused us way more damage from a reputation perspective than merging. One of the other great things about the funders, though, so we had some corporate partners, we had some community foundation partners, but they didn't just give us money. They were very willing to give us not only thought, but talent. So we had the opportunity, one partner actually loaned us 8 of their human resources teams. So that human resource team is actually the one that created all of our new employee handbook manuals and helped us think through some of the employee processes. How are we going to do benefits? How are we going to do time off? How are we going to structure payroll? Who was going to handle payroll? Things that I certainly did not have the background in. And Mary said we were a combined staff of 17. We didn't have that in-house. And so not only did they give us the financial resources to fund the merger negotiations, they gave us people from their teams. They also contributed great input. So when we really were struggling with, we think this is going to be a community issue, they were they were kind of the mirror that we could hold ourselves up to. And they would be like, yeah, no, really, we're not going to care if you move from this community to this community, or if you move from this community, you need to talk to X, Y, and Z other people who've attempted that and have not been successful, so you can better learn what to do. So they really connected us back to the community. And we talked to 4 other nonprofits that had attempted very similar mergers between similar communities, all the way dating 20 years back. Some were successful, some were not. And so we got a lot of great lessons learned through that. Which kind of leads me to that third point, that engage expert advisors and resources. Jamie and I knew our mission, we knew our programs, we knew our people. But before this, we did not understand what it was, working with Scott on our financial business modeling. We didn't understand what that was. And now I know what a pro forma is because we've gone through that process, but we had a lot to learn the first time through. And so maybe not so much with the first 2 phases, the feasibility study and the merger negotiation, but definitely when we got to the integration of the merger, we really looked to outsource as many components as we could. So IT, we outsourced, we moved into a new building. And so we had someone help us with building and facility management, because we were negotiating a new lease with a new property owner and a new building. And so there were a lot of unknowns. We outsourced our marketing to a local company who focused on not necessarily here's your new logo, right? As Mary indicated, we were held accountable to Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, but we needed to know, okay, who are our audiences and how do we communicate this message, and what is the best channel? Is it social media? Is it printed newsletter? Is it open house forums? Is it town hall forums? So really understanding the audiences we were communicating to and why. The engaging expert advisors and resources then becomes cyclical with the inviting funders as supporters. All in all, we raised $250,000 to support the merger, and that is what it cost us. We really, we came out balanced. I think I had 18 cents left over when we got done with all of our accounting. And so we invested the right resources. But all along, we kept saying this is too important to do it wrong. And that's kind of where, again, that focus on the mission. We had a combined 96 years of serving our community. We were dealing with children and we're dealing with their livelihood. And so we have to make sure that something as simple as the building does not negatively impact the children. So we really focused on making sure we had the right people behind the scenes to drive the merger so that from a program service delivery standpoint, it was as seamless as possible. So those are 3 of the key success factors. And what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Scott so he can continue to share a little bit more.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I have a question for you, if I may,
Yeah.
Lindsay. You mentioned that you proactively went to your funders and approached them and had open conversations with them. I know that many in the nonprofit world, there's not always a comfortable relationship there with funders, and it might vary depending on who the funder is. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. On how was that process of opening up and having those discussions, and were you concerned at all that, well, if we have this discussion now, could there be negative blowback? Like, for example, if we don't end up merging, because at that point, you didn't know whether this was going to be a result. You didn't even know whether it was necessarily going to be the best strategy.
Right. I will tell you, in my heart, I knew, I knew it was the best strategy, but you're right. I didn't know if it was going to fly, so to speak. A couple things. I just so strongly believe, yes, there is a power differential between nonprofits and funders. The people who need the money and the people who give the money always have a very tenuous relationship. But I also strongly believe that nonprofits need our community members, So there's responsibility on the part of funders to be able to say, we're all trying to do good to benefit our community. And so I went to the funder I had the best relationship with. I went to the funder who I knew got it. They already gave general operating unrestricted dollars. They were like, just use this money however you need to. They were the one who continued to say, we have internal marketing, or we have, they continue to offer us opportunity to do continuous improvement and lean development. So they were very forward thinking. And so we went to them first, knowing that the initial phase of the project wasn't as high of a financial investment as the whole component would be. And we said, are you willing to be our first financial partner? Can we get you on board? Can we do this study? And then can we brainstorm with you on how we get others involved? And we were very fortunate. So that funder was the J.J. Keller Foundation. And they were like, absolutely. So they contributed majority of the financial resources needed to start the process. Both myself and Jamie were pretty strong believers that we each also needed to put forth some skin in the game financially. So we both had our agencies cover a portion of the cost as well. And then that ended up being the only thing we ever ended up having to pay for. And then once we saw the results of the feasibility study, J.J. Keller Foundation's executive director, Heidi Dusek, she was the one who was like, let me now put pressure on my peers. So she's the one who helped gather and convene the roundtable of funders. And she said, you guys need to hear why we are choosing to back this project.
Yeah. Yeah, you turned your funders into allies in the process. And one thing I learned, and Lindsay, I know that you know this, both Mary and I are past executive directors. And in fact, Mary, I think we've done it a few times each, a few. And so we learn things over time. And I think over time, it took a while, but I came to understand that funders often really appreciate when you tell them the truth. I mean, Isn't that a timely issue this week, really? Let's just tell the truth. Let's invite people in. And there was a point where I got comfortable having, conversations about some of the challenges, even though everything didn't necessarily make us look perfect. But the thing is, the funders know we're not perfect. And when you put it out there, I think it makes them relax. And I really applaud you, Lindsay, for the way that you build a coalition around this. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about other success factors. So we talked about doing the business model analysis. And so Lindsay said a few minutes ago that she knew in her heart that it was going to be right to merge. And very often we do have that feeling, and it often is right. And what the business model analysis gets to is not so much the what, but the how. So even if merger is a great idea, there certainly are ways to botch it up, believe me. There are examples of mergers that didn't work out that well. And very often it came from not doing the upfront work. So I often draw the comparison to painting my house, the interior of my house. And the first house I got, I had to spend weeks just scraping and sanding and spackling. I thought, this is never going to end. But that last stage where things come together is sometimes the quickest part, where you actually put the paint on the wall. But there is all that background work we need to do. Business model analysis is part of that. And what we did is we really drilled into, well, what will happen if these organizations come together? We want to aim for financial health and financial sustainability. What decisions do we have to consider in order to do that? And so Lindsay and I had a lot of long conversations about how to make it happen, because when we just jammed the two organizations together, surprise, surprise, it didn't work, and it rarely does. So what I find is the business model analysis is kind of a reality check. Very often, a lot of our intuitive things are turn out to be accurate, but what I find is about a third of them, a third of our intuitions turn out to be spot on. About a third of them turn out to be not too far from the truth, but then about a third, and maybe it's 25%, maybe it's 20%, but there's a significant number of assumptions we made that in fact don't work unless we take corrective measures. And so what business model analysis enabled us to do is figure out, well, what costs do we need to have? What growth rates do we need to have in fundraising if this is going to work? If we need a certain growth rate, what kind of staffing do we need in fundraising to reach that? Very often, if we look at these benefits, costs, and risks that are on your screen, some of the benefits of a merger are not the most intuitive ones. For example, being able to specialize your staff more. We're in a very specialized economy. It's been getting more and more specialized ever since World War II. And so a larger organization can specialize more. And so when you have a specialist who's doing something like working on an individual giving program, they can go deeper. They can really develop their own skills. They can have a greater impact. And that's just one example. So there are things like that we want to think about, but there's a balancing act. And business model analysis helped us do that. Another thing I want to talk about in terms of this being a very systematic process is that we spent upfront time interviewing, having confidential interviews with a lot of different stakeholders inside and outside the organization. And what I really appreciated about that process was it helped us understand as consultants where the challenges were going to be, which again, were not necessarily all intuitive. So Mary and I spent a lot of time working behind the scenes with each of the partners, trying to figure out how do we resolve an issue that's likely to come up that maybe everyone hadn't thought about. And this is where, it becomes, I guess, the devil's in the details, where we have to work out what the solutions are and plot a path to get there. And it made the negotiation stage so much easier, where we had a lot of challenging issues, but we had good relationships and understanding of where to go with that. We also knew who supported this in the end and what the upsides were going to be. So it became a very holistic process. And one of the goals was to retain as many of the staff as we could of both organizations and develop them. And that's where the interactive discussions were really helpful throughout those first two phases of the project. So I guess, I'll leave it there, and I'd like to turn it over to Mary to continue this discussion.
Thanks, Scott. Yes, I love to say the shuttle diplomacy that happens in negotiations is really one of the key, I think, the art of the negotiations, and really being able to hear both sides and understand what their motivations and desires are, and moving to a place of co-creating the future. And that, we really established that early on in the negotiation process. But what you've got in front of you right now is what came through in the assessment process of what do each of these organizations bring to the table, and how could they leverage even more impact and have greater results, serve more kids in the community if they were coming together. And so it was really clear there was a lot of complementary assets between each of the organizations and what they brought to the table. As we've mentioned, Big Brothers Big Sisters is an affiliate of a national organization, so there was access to national resources around programming. They had a lot of support and ability to steward, and have done a great job in stewarding their alumni. So that community connection with alumni and the affinity to the organization's mission. Their staff was larger, was about twice the size of, maybe even a little bit larger than the Best Friends staff, which had already started to move in that specializing journey that Scott had mentioned. So there was more depth there. And they also had a fair amount of cash liquidity. They did not have the constraints of government funding, which can often hamstring nonprofit organizations as far as their finances. On the best friend side of the table, they really had a community-based focus, and they had built strong relationships with schools and had offered site-based programming, which was an area of interest for Big Brothers Big Sisters, but they had not developed that delivery process system. They also offered case management and family support services, which were really clear that oftentimes Big Brothers Big Sisters families desired, but they didn't offer those services. And then on the financial side, Best Friends had a long-standing endowment, so they had that financial stability of an endowment that was unrestricted. From the very beginning of their conversations in the negotiations process, and even in the feasibility study, the partners constantly were driven by the guiding principle of what is best for the kids, and how do we create something that will make this organization better together for the community and for the kids that we serve. So the other thing I wanted to mention here was really thinking about, and we've touched on it already, is some of the aspects that happen in the integration process. And culture, again, we can't underestimate or understate the importance of addressing culture. And as I mentioned earlier, the most well thought out merger will fail to realize its full potential if people in the combined organizations are still holding to their different sets of expectations and they can't effectively work together. If people are still in their mindset of this is how we do it, we don't do it that way, then you will not have that combined culture to be able to move the organization forward. And both Lindsay and Jamie really understood the importance of cultural integration, and they were proactive in engaging an organizational culture consultant to provide the support to create that combined culture that would build the staff members' trust in one another to move the organization to the next level. In addition, during the integration process, remember, we have a small and mighty staff, and yet they're trying to keep current operations moving as well as create a new system and structures of a combined organization. So to assist in the development of the implementation plan and the integration process, and Lindsay mentioned this earlier about engaging outside experts, Big Brothers Big Sisters contracted with a dedicated project manager who worked in partnership with me and the merger integration work group. We had a group that was comprised of staff members to support the 5 different merger integration work groups that were established to move all those different work streams forward and have accountability and really set up those implementation plans, that there were roadmaps for all of the different aspects of moving to a combined organization. The last success factor that I want to highlight here is with respect to communications. And this was an area of great intention starting from the negotiations process, that internal and external communications was always top of mind throughout the process, that at the end of each merger negotiation meeting, that there was a discussion around what's our external communication statement. And it was wordsmithed and it was agreed to by the members of the Joint Negotiations Committee. And that statement was then shared throughout each organization, and it could be shared with the community. During the integration phase, there were also meetings that were set up to really listening meetings, and also meetings with different important partners, the mentors and families, to really communicate the steps in the process, where they were in the process, and gather any questions that those different important stakeholders had. In addition, there was a internal weekly merger update that was shared with all staff during the integration process. And that also perhaps was shared with the board as well. So this level of communication, which might have felt like hyper communication, but you can never communicate too much when people are in a state of concern and, fear of the unknown or anxiety. It really helped foster trust and ease that anxiety about the unknown as the organization was moving through the integration process. So with that, I don't know, Scott, if you want to add anything on that,
I'd love to chime in. Just to emphasize how important that communication piece is, that's what experts in change management, that's the one thing they all mention is as a key to success is communication. Just keeping people aware of what's going on, engaging them, asking for their input and their thoughts. Not everyone is going to love the process of a merger or even necessarily be committed to the end result, but the more you can communicate with folks, the more you can bring people along, and some people may not end up coming along, and that may be okay. One other thing I wanted to comment on is with regard to the cost of doing this. There are a variety of ways to make that happen, and one thing that Big Brothers Big Sisters did, which I love, is they really looked at the full costs, not just the direct expense of, for example, hiring a consultant. They looked at, well, how much staff time will we need to put into this, and what will the value of that be, and being able to itemize those things. But there are different ways to do it, and different mergers can happen in different forms. Some mergers might be quite a bit less expensive. One thing that I really liked was having a dedicated project manager for the integration. And sometimes there's a staff person available who could do that, someone who's already on the staff. In other cases, you might want to get a dedicated resource, bring in someone new just for that role. In some cases, volunteer groups can help. We talked about, like with benefits and integrating the two salary structures and those issues. And I've worked on mergers even with large organizations where board members were able to bring in resources from their firms that could really help with that. Public relations and communications. Some organizations may have staff on board who can do those pieces. It may not be necessary to farm those out. So there's some pieces where really almost no organization will have the in-house resources. Legal support is one of them. We didn't mention due diligence, where we want to get a CPA involved. Those aren't hugely expensive costs, but they're important to consider. And then consultants like us, not the biggest cost, but something that may be assisted by a foundation grant here or there. But the cost, there are different ways to address that. It need not be prohibitive.
Thanks, Scott, for sharing those insights. Right, and every merger is different, and that's why this case study is success factors of a merger, which is this merger, because each organization is coming to the table with different questions, different assets, and different desires for future outcomes. So that's what makes this field really exciting. And Scott and I have worked together for more than 10 years in doing this work, and no two mergers are the same. So we have time now for questions, and if people have thoughts that have been percolating, please feel free to put those in the chat. And I just want to offer, Lindsay, while people are doing that, if you've got some reflections or some key questions in what we shared, we'll give Lindsay an opportunity to offer any other insights or just thoughts as you've been listening to the speed presentation of your long journey over over 2 years now.
Yeah, it's just wild to even think, right? So for everyone listening, we completed the merger in completed. We have legally integrated in January of 2020. We had so many plans. We did our open house in February. We had so many plans for like the cultural development, and then March of 2020 hit, right? So we effectively ran our 2020 year as a newly merged agency who had only been in the same building together for 8 weeks. And I think, you know, the one thing, if I could go back and I would do differently, is we focus so much on change management and culture for the team. We overlooked the change management for some of our clients. Like, we told them what was happening and why, but we didn't take the same extensive care in really supporting and helping them come through some of that resistance. And so we saw a little bit after the fact that we were like, if we had just applied the same level of communication and change support that we did to our staff as we did to some of our mentors in our program, we probably could have overcome an obstacle. But you know, it's that Mary, you talked about in the beginning about, you know, the timing of agency leadership. I think the other thing really is for 18 months, Jamie and I did 2 jobs. And so we were just exhausted. And most small nonprofits could probably identify with, you have a senior leader and then you've got great boots on the ground workers, but you don't always have that middle management level to help allow for some delegation of responsibility. And so we had to train up our middle managers at the same time as we were needing them to make decisions. And so there was, it was chaotic, but we did it. And I think we did it well. We're all still here, so we did it well.
Thanks, Lindsay, for providing some of that context. I see we've got a question that's come in related to culture. And it says, do some old culture strategies get sacrificed even if they've been successful?
I was going to pull up that question so I can read
some
it.
Old culture, so this is the question, do some old culture strategies get sacrificed even if they've been successful? So I'll just start off kind of generically, and then Lindsay, you could chime in here as well. You know, when we look at culture, and part of that, part of the integration process, or even sort of starting at the end of the negotiation process, I had each organization kind of do an exercise around what are their rituals, what are some of the practices that are really near and dear to them and important, and then recognizing, you know, what those are from each organization, and then deciding, and what do we want to create together as far as new practices and new rituals. So Lindsay, you want to add to that just with respect to that piece of the journey with respect to best friends and big brothers, big sisters?
Yeah, so my thought would be absolutely they all get sacrificed, because it's what was successful in the old doesn't mean it's going to be sick. You add one person to a new and it's no longer the same group, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean it gets sacrificed, but we had to be willing to say everything is on the table and everything is open to being, you know, like we have to be willing to come from this place where there aren't any, we're not going to hold on to these sacred, but we always did this. Because once you hold on to that, that becomes the pervasive mentality. It was not an easy journey, but I don't know that culture ever is. I mean, I think culture is an ongoing journey. It started at the top. It really took myself and Jamie, who started serving as our chief program officer, and then our other C-suite was our chief development officer. We did a lot of hard work those first couple months. I kind of joked it was like going to counseling, because we really had to build up the trust and the vulnerability if we were going to echo it through the agency. And then it's hard to separate out what was typical post-merger and what was COVID, to be quite honest, right? So we kind of hit this point where it was like, it no longer was before merger, after merger. It was before Safer at Home, after Safer at Home for us. It helped in some ways. COVID helped. It forced us to get really, to let go of certain processes and to find the way we could communicate best. And then in the summer, we noticed it was hurting us because we expected our relationships to be further along. So we really had to get intentional about dialing back into some of that trust management. We focused
Right.
on Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions. And so.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. I can see there's another question here related to board integration, and it says any key success factors and or obstacles related to board integration, how much board involvement is recommended in the integration team. Scott, you want to take that one?
Yeah, how much board involvement? So, well, maybe I'll comment first about integrating the boards, because that's part of a merger. Integrating the staff is probably one of the biggest challenges there, but integrating the boards is important too. And usually in a merger, the new board will be a hybrid of the old board. And so boards have, when I think of culture, I think of like, what are the codes of behavior? What are the ways that we express our values, and the ways that we kind of the underlying ways we conduct our business. So how do we run meetings? Since that's much of the experience of being a board. What kind of input do we welcome? What kind of, how do we handle dissent? In one board, you might have a culture where dissension is discouraged, and dissenting views and dissenting votes. And another board, it might be very, very favorable. And that's something we see in different ethnic cultures as well. Sometimes, how do we handle those types of communication? So being very proactive is a good way to do that. Now, there isn't necessarily a right and a wrong in culture. And part of the question, I think, was getting at, well, if something was working before in both organizations, but they were different, maybe how do we land on the right way? And my kind of all-purpose answer to that is, let's be proactive and discuss it and put it on the table and talk about what we aspire to, and then try to live that. And so sometimes cultures develop kind of accidentally, and depending on, just this is the way we've always done it, and that may be okay in some cases. But I want to comment on one other thing, because I think the question may have gotten at, what board involvement should there be in staff integration? And I think that's one of these areas where, as Mary said, every merger is different. And I think it depends on what the board's involvement with staff is. Generally speaking, I think this is domain of the executive director and the senior managers.
Yeah, and I would add to that the board has its own integration process that it has to be working on. And so, for them to be focusing on themselves and how do we build, our combined new board and its new, ways of, as you said, board norms and practices and policies. And so all of that work, and I know, Lindsay, that you worked with the new leadership and did a board retreat early on in the integration phase for the board itself. The board members, there were a couple, I think, board members that were engaged in some of the integration work because of their content expertise and, functional expertise as members of those work groups, but not necessarily on that higher level merger integration team that met on a monthly basis that we met together. I don't know if you want to add anything else on that.
We also we knew our go live date was January 1st. So starting in October of 2019, any of the best friend board members who were going to be carrying on into the Big Brothers Big Sisters board were invited to the Big Brothers Big Sisters board meetings, because we wanted them as observers to start to see kind of how things ran. We wanted their opportunity to say, well, why do you guys do it this way? This is, because from my experience, Jamie and I could talk about how we ran the meetings, but the board member experience was completely unique. And so we wanted that opportunity for that feedback. And then in my role, knowing I was going to be retained as the CEO, within the first 3 weeks of January, I made sure I met with every board member individually, especially the new or incoming board members. Those meetings were a bit longer, but I was like, I want you to get to know me. I want you to get to know my energy. I very clearly am energetic, and I have a lot to say. And, so I wanted them to get to know me and develop that strong relationship. And then we did a half day full board retreat, and it was about branding. It was about who is Big Brothers Big Sisters, and it was about the roles of the board. It wasn't our strategic plan. It wasn't who are the staff. I mean, it was really trying to reorient the board together.
Great. We have another question that's come in about an experience that we are beginning, I'll just read it. We're in the beginning of exploration process with another organization. I've read the process of exploration due diligence is 4 to 8 months, and then organizations integration and legal execution as additional time. Is this reasonable? So, I mean, I would say, yeah, that's pretty reasonable, with the assessment process and then the negotiation process. And it really depends on if anything comes up, particularly in the negotiation process, that needs to be worked through before you can move forward with, continuing the negotiations. But I think, that's relatively on target. This merger was the feasibility and the negotiations was about a year, and then the integration process happened. Scott, you want to add anything on that?
No, I agree.
Okay.
Well put.
Here's a question, and there's a question about blogs and articles, and both on Scott's website at PIM Group and Vista Global both have blogs posted related to governance and mergers. So you can take a look at each of our websites for any particular articles. And then here's a question, what's the story behind the genesis for the idea of a merger, and how much internal advocacy did you have to do with boards and the executive team? So I think that one's for you, Lindsay.
Yeah. So when I started with the agency in October of 2016, and one of my first questions was, well, how do we collaborate with all these other youth-serving organizations? So whatever community you're in, you're going to typically find a Big Brothers Big Sisters or some kind of youth mentoring, typically a Boys and Girls Club, a YMCA, a whole host of things. And the answer was, oh no, we don't. It's too competitive. Not necessarily from the money side, but we all need the same volunteers. And so there's not a lot of willingness to collaborate. So I went through that first year and just kind of tried to learn and observe. And then, quite frankly, best friends had to change over in executive directors. And I saw that as an opportunity. Their former executive director had been there for 12 years and was not open to a conversation. Their new executive director, I knew from some other things. And so I took her to lunch. I took Jamie to lunch and I said, here's the deal. We are going to struggle. It is an ongoing struggle to get our two most critical resources, people and donations. And I just think we could do it if we did it together. I just think it would be so much smoother. And so it took a while. Quite frankly, going back to the funders, we had a funder who said, we're done. We're done funding both of you. You do the exact same thing. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, you're bigger, you get our money. A little risky from the funder side, but they did that knowing we were willing to talk about merger. And so they were like, does that give the board some pressure to see if you aren't willing to even consider making a smart business change? Why should we continue to fund you? And that did it for the boards. But it was really,
well, I think, as you mentioned earlier, Lindsay, it was being open and willing to have the conversation and the feasibility study. So it was that, let's go through this first phase of feasibility and see what comes out of it. And, that being kind of the first step. There's a follow-on question for you, Lindsay, and I'm just going to offer it right now because it adds to what you were just saying. How did you moderate your intuition of merger being the right thing to not overwhelm but encourage the board to pursue the merger? So it's kind of what you just offered, but anything else you want to add to that? I
really had to learn to stop talking. I knew in my heart of hearts, right? And Mary will tell you this, the number of times she cut me off in a meeting, I was like, Lindsay, I had to be willing to say, my intuition is telling me this is right. But if everything else says it's not, then I need to be willing to accept that, because me trying to force something just because I think it's a good idea is never going to be successful. So there kind of came this path where I really had to be willing to accept both what I intuitively believed and the kind of succumb to the process, so to speak. And that's why I was grateful, though, that we had Mary, we had Scott, because I trusted the process. I knew, if it was just Jamie and I trying to do the feasibility study, I would have had no clue if I was doing it right. So having people who have that history, who can be non-biased and give you non-biased feedback, really allowed me to trust in the process, even when I wanted it a certain way.
Well, and I think what that also points to in any merger, this journey of going through feasibility assessment, negotiations, and integration is you all had been working on this, thinking about this, living this day to day for a long period of time, and different people are coming into this experience along the way with not having been thinking about it. So it's really giving people that opportunity to catch up to where you are. So board members to catch up in thinking this through. And so, as consultants and being able to facilitate that process of helping people, catch up in understanding and thinking about the possibilities and the pros and the cons to then be able to see where you are at the same place.
And that's maybe the thing I would go back and add into our timeline is Jamie and I, once we knew the boards voted in July, we were going to integrate in January, we had this timeline. We should have built in a couple weeks just to allow staff to catch up thinking wise, right? So there were moments where we realized we're like 5 steps ahead of them, not in action, but in thought. And we didn't appropriately give credence to what it would take for them to get there because we had lived it for 2 years.
Yeah. Here's another question. Hi, Sarah. Good to have you on. Our nonprofit works in international education, travel programming for youth, and the impact of the pandemic has been dramatic on our industry. And in this time, some organizations have been more open to conversations about strategic alliances and even expressed interest in exploring possible merger. Given the uncertainties we still face in this time, what else should we be asking ourselves before we consider stage one of an assessment? We hear loud and clear how much work this is. Scott, you want to start with that?
Well, yes, and I have some good news on that. Is if we think of the merger process as distinct phases, the assessment is a phase. And what I always tell people is we have to go into the assessment with an open mind. So we don't want to go in knowing the answer. We might have an inclination for where this may likely go, but we want to have an open mind. What will the partnership look like? What kind of time frame will it be? Does the different options that Mary discussed, strategic alliance, joint venture, merger, and in parentheses, I'll mention that there are 4 distinct types of merger in the US, and not all of them will be appropriate for a situation. So the assessment process is a way to do that. But when you commit to an assessment process, you're not committing to merge. You're not committing to any outcome. Most of the work is in integration. And the assessment process is actually not a huge commitment. It's a tangible step that you can take. And I think that it is one thing I would advise everyone is to keep an open mind about just participating in an assessment. And it's okay to do the assessment and say, we don't think we want to move forward after this. I think the assessment also is valuable in narrowing the options down to those that are most feasible. So it may be that an assessment is likely to result in a negotiation phase, but it might make the negotiation phase much more productive, which makes it much less time consuming. It can shorten it from a year to 4 to 5 months or something like that. So I think that the assessment is a great time to be considering all the issues, and you don't have to put the burden on yourself of knowing a lot of answers before that.
I would add to that, even sort of the pre-assessment phase is what do we bring to a partnership and really getting clear about your own organization's areas of assets and your areas of challenge. So thinking about, how worthy are we as a partner, potential, partner to another organization? So that initial reflection on where are we strong, what are our, unique assets, and where are we challenged, so that when you are potentially having conversations, preliminary conversations, Lindsay and Jamie had preliminary conversations before they, reached out to me, and, they talked to other folks as well, that you are better set to think about, here's what we offer, and here's where we think that, we have challenges, and that potentially a partnership might support us. And is there complementarity?
Yeah, and Mary, to tag on to that, what that kind of thinking can do is help you focus on which partner might be most appropriate. Do they need what we offer? Do they offer what we need? And if we don't know, there's a way to explore that. And if we, and the assessment can be part of that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lindsay. Yep. Mm-hmm.
While it was a ton of work, one, it was really fun. And two, it has paid off tenfold. So it's one of those things where I'm able to look back and this is a great way to engage your board, right? The board was very supportive in knowing that we were now managing this whole other set of responsibilities. So they had the conversation with us of what are you going to let go and how are you going to balance this? But it was work well worth it, if that makes sense, because it did make the integration go so much smoother because we had done so much intentionality around how the work was done.
Nice. Here's a question around staff. So for you, Lindsay, can you say more about the attitude and beliefs of existing staff before, during, and after the integration, and any anecdotes about how resistance was dealt with or mitigated for those most resistant of doing things new or differently?
Yeah.
There's a juicy one.
Yeah, we each had, so Jamie came into the partnership, she had a staff of 5, including herself. One had been there for 27 years, one had been there for 22, one had been there for 10. I came into the partnership with a staff of 13. One had been there for 30 and one had been there for 23. So we both had staff who, between the 4 of them, had more years to these agencies than anyone else. So we really were like, how are we going to deal with these changes? Honestly, we brought in a local change management firm. So we brought in a group, and the first thing they did is they just focused on change awareness and where people were in the stages of change. So they met with everyone directly. They are the ones who did the empathy interviews. They collected feedback, not only about how resistant or open the individuals were to change, but their perceptions of both myself and Jamie to lead them through the change. That information was shared with myself and Jamie, right? And at any time as a leader, you're getting kind of that 360 feedback. It's always a little bit of a double-edged sword. And so Jamie and I we took what we learned from that, and then we adapted that. We adapted our model moving forward to fit those needs. That is where those weekly communication emails came from. That is where our concept of starting to have all staff meetings in November, even though we were 2 separate agencies. So we try to incorporate some of that into what we did. And then we planned in April to bring those same consultants back and to start really doing a lot of cultural work with us so that we could reform collectively as a team what our new culture would be. We knew we needed to just give a period of norming, storming, all that stuff. So we were like, look, January and February, March are just going to be a little rough. We're going to tackle it the best we can. We're going to have open communication. None of us expected COVID. And then individually, we really just continue to try to touch base, right? I can't speak enough about rounding informally, and constantly saying, I'm here. What do you need? Can you talk to me? I may not be able to answer the question, but I want to know. I mean, it just, so much time was spent just really trying to be there for the staff. And so that, and then just they wanted to know what was happening. There was a lot of, yeah, we hear you're here for us, but what's happening to my vacation? What's happening to my pay? So the very first thing we tackled was the employee component, because they needed to know what's their job, what are their hours, what's their pay, are there promotions, are there demotions? So, and then there's a whole lot more. You can reach out to me individually and I'll talk.
And Lindsay, I mean, you are a par excellence communicator, and that is why this piece, even though, as you said, it was rocky, was successful, because that's one of your strengths as a leader, and that's you know, even when you felt like it was too much, you just continued to do what was needed or asked for from your staff about communication. So I think that really was a critical, important success factor.
Thank you. And the people,
do you have what you want to add to that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the people who couldn't get on board left. We knew that. We saw a couple people leave in summer, and we were like, that's okay. And I can say 100% now, every single person on our team has come up to me and said, we could never have survived COVID if we didn't merge, right? So unfortunately, we had the opportunity to put us to the test and we survived it. So as far as attitudes and belief now, we're doing really well.
Great. Anyway, one last question I think we've got time for, and here's one. What are recommendations? This is an interesting one. What are recommendations for an all-volunteer organization to merge with a regional organization that has a small, medium-sized staff? So I'm not sure what recommendations you are referring to. I mean, I think the process is the same with respect to assessment, and, you know, thinking about how, you know, all the stages that we just talked about. You know, what are the benefits? What are the desired outcomes? What are the drivers that you see to move the organization forward? What are the challenges? So the process would be the same, regardless of if it's an all-volunteer organization or it's a staff-led organization. I don't know if there's something you want to add there, Scott.
I agree with that. And I think the process is the same, regardless of the size or type of the organization. The details will be different. The nuances will be different. And it might be simpler in some cases. There might be complexities in other cases. That's all expected, but I agree with you on that. You know, Mary, I saw one more question if we have a. Yep,
we do. We have a couple minutes. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yes, let's do it.
This was from David, and it's about recommendations to foster cultural integration given no chance to meet in person this year. Mm-hmm. And obviously we hope this is not a permanent situation, because that will certainly make things complicated, but we don't, we think that we will return to something more normal before long. But this is a challenge, and I wanted to address it, even though I don't feel like I know the answer, but the way
Lindsay lives this.
You're
right?
living it, yeah.
She was doing integration during COVID, and with respect to how do you celebrate, or when you can't meet in person, how did you handle those pieces?
Communication. I mean, so we started off and we had daily COVID check-ins that were not just about business, but about person. And then my commitment to the team is I would never plan more than a month out. So every month I was saying what's working, what's not working, what's getting exhausting, what feels fake. And then a couple months in, we decided we needed to have a team of employees directly planning. We call it our connections committee. So it's not senior leader led, it's employees planning for the employee team, how we stay connected. And they've done everything where like you just drive by it. Like for Christmas, we all got gingerbread houses and we just Zoomed, and we did it via Zoom, and we all got little trick or treat baskets that we stopped by the office and picked up in a socially distanced, safe manner. So, but we relied on our employees to give us the ideas, not the leaders.
Nice. All right, we are kicking out of time, unfortunately. But if there's any other questions that pop up in the queue, we'll try to address those and send out responses. I just want to invite Lindsay to share your final thoughts about what advice you would offer organizations that are considering merger.
Don't do it alone. Reach out. Again, right? Everyone was so willing to talk to us, both nonprofit, for-profit. Mary met with us a handful of times before we ever formally signed on with her. I think once you've been through a merger, you have empathy for people going through it and you just want to help. And so if you ever find you're doing it alone, you're probably doing it wrong. So reach out and form connection.
Thanks, Lindsay. And just thank you all for joining us today. You can reach out to us by email. We'll provide all those our email addresses in the follow-up email you'll get after today with the recording. I also want to thank Scott and Lindsay personally for your partnership and sharing this journey and the factors that really contributed to the success of the Big Brothers Big Sister merger that's really enhanced your ability to serve more kids and have greater impact in the community, which is really what it's all about. Thanks all. We're so glad that you joined us today. Have a good rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.